On a blistering July afternoon in 1972, while every other farmer in the county frantically rushed to sell their freshly harvested wheat at rock-bottom prices to satisfy their crushing bank loans, Silas Caldwell did the exact opposite. He quietly hauled tens of thousands of bushels back to his own property and locked them inside 3 massive steel grain bins. The local farmers and the arrogant elevator manager laughed out loud, calling the quiet 65-year-old man a greedy fool who was destined to watch his entire crop rot in storage. But Silas possessed something those panicking men did not. He possessed absolute patience and zero debt. Just a few months later, an unprecedented global event would cause wheat prices to violently explode, turning Silas Caldwell's stubborn silence into millions of dollars in cold hard cash and completely humiliating every single man who had dared to mock his strategy. Let me tell you about the summer of 1972, because understanding the sheer financial panic of that particular harvest is the only way to truly appreciate what Silas Caldwell accomplished. It was the most massive wheat harvest the Midwest had seen in an entire decade, but instead of celebrating, most farmers were sweating pure terror. Over the previous 5 years, almost every man in the county had aggressively borrowed massive sums of money from the local banks to purchase additional acreage and shiny new diesel tractors. They were drowning in crushing high-interest debt. When the summer harvest finally arrived, the massive, unpredicted oversupply of grain immediately drove the market prices straight down to the absolute bottom. The heavily indebted farmers possessed absolutely no choice. They had to sell their entire crop the exact second it came out of the field, desperately taking whatever miserable pennies the local grain elevator offered, just to satisfy their upcoming loan payments and keep the ruthless bankers away from their front doors. Now, let me tell you about Silas Caldwell. Silas was 65 years old, and he operated his modest Midwestern farm exactly the same way his grandfather had operated it. He drove an older, weathered mechanical tractor that leaked a tiny bit of oil, but always started on the very first crank. He wore faded denim shirts and thick leather boots that had been meticulously resoled 3 different times. But Silas possessed one incredibly rare and powerful advantage over every single one of his loud, ambitious neighbors. He did not owe a single solitary dime to any bank on earth. His rolling land was completely paid for. His aging machinery was paid for. He was an entirely free man. While the dusty county roads were absolutely choked with a frantic, desperate parade of overloaded trucks rushing to sell cheap wheat to the local elevator, Silas drove his modest grain wagons in the exact opposite direction. He steadily hauled every single load back to his own quiet property. He carefully backed his wagons up to a long mechanical auger and slowly transferred tens of thousands of golden bushels into 3 massive silver steel storage bins that stood like giant unyielding monuments behind his weathered barn. Once the bins were completely full to the absolute brim, Silas locked the heavy steel hatches tight and flipped the mechanical switch to engage the massive internal aeration fans. The deep continuous hum of the spinning fan blades echoed across the quiet farm, doing the critical work of keeping the massive mountain of stored wheat perfectly cool and perfectly dry. Silas wiped the thick harvest dust from his deeply lined brow and made a quiet, stubborn vow to himself. He would not sell a single seed of his harvest until the market begged him for it. He possessed the ultimate luxury that true debt-free farming provides. The beautiful, simple ability to patiently wait while everyone else panicked. Let me take you inside the local grain elevator office on a dusty Friday morning, because that is where the cruel nature of panicked men truly reveals itself. The small wood-paneled office was absolutely packed with desperate, tired farmers waiting for their turn to unload their wheat for miserable pennies. The air was thick with cigarette smoke and the heavy smell of sweat and pure financial fear. Among them was a younger farmer named Gordon. Gordon was 35 years old and deeply in debt from purchasing a massive modern tractor and hundreds of acres of overpriced land the previous spring. He was angry at the dropping market, angry at the demanding bankers, and desperately looking for someone to look down on to make his own terrible situation feel slightly better. When Silas Caldwell quietly walked through the glass door to purchase a simple cup of black coffee, the crowded room went completely silent. The elevator manager was a heavy-set man who made his comfortable living taking advantage of desperate farmers. He leaned far over the long wooden counter, looked directly at Silas, and loudly asked if the old man was lost, since he clearly was not delivering any grain to sell today. Gordon immediately chimed in from his corner booth. He laughed a harsh, nervous laugh and told the entire room that Silas was currently busy building a luxury winter hotel for the local field mice. Gordon stood up and loudly mocked the old farmer, claiming that hoarding wheat during a massive national surplus was the absolute dumbest financial decision a man could possibly make. He boldly predicted to the nodding crowd that the market prices would only continue to crash, and that Silas would eventually have to beg the elevator to take his rotten, moldy grain for absolutely nothing. Now let me pause here and ask you to truly picture that specific scene. Picture a crowded room full of heavily indebted, stressed out men aggressively laughing at a completely debt-free man simply because he chose to do something entirely different. They mocked his rusted grain wagons, they mocked his ancient tractor, and they viciously mocked his refusal to join their collective panic. They called him a stubborn old fool who simply did not understand how modern agricultural economics worked. But they were not laughing because they truly believed Silas was foolish. If you looked closely at their tired eyes, you would see the truth. They were laughing because deep down, his quiet independence and his ability to hold on to his harvest absolutely terrified them. He possessed the ultimate freedom they had completely surrendered to the local bank. Silas did not get angry, and he did not raise his voice. He did not try to explain his long-term strategy or defend his careful decisions to men who were completely blinded by their own financial panic. He simply reached into his pocket, pulled a worn leather wallet from his faded denim overalls, and placed a single crisp paper bill on the wooden counter to pay for his black coffee. He looked directly into Gordon's bloodshot, tired eyes and calmly stated that acting out of pure desperation has never successfully paid off a bank loan. Then Silas picked up his hot coffee, turned his back on the cruel, mocking laughter of the crowded room, and walked quietly back out into the blistering summer sun to carefully check the internal temperature of his massive steel storage bins. Let me tell you about the long, quiet months that followed, because that is when the real psychological war began. Autumn slowly turned into a bitter, freezing winter across the Midwestern plains. The heavily indebted farmers like Gordon had taken their miserable harvest checks and immediately handed them over to the local bank just to survive another season. But instead of learning their lesson, some of them borrowed even more money to buy brand new pickup trucks they could barely afford. They drove past Silas Caldwell's modest farm, constantly honking their loud horns and pointing mockingly at the 3 silent steel bins. They joked endlessly at the local diner that Silas was trying to age his wheat like fine wine, and that by spring he would be shoveling out tons of completely useless, rotten mold. But Silas completely ignored their noise. He understood something that those younger, arrogant men did not. Harvesting the grain was only half the battle. Storing it properly required the absolute focus and discipline of a master craftsman. Every single morning, before the sun even crested the frozen horizon, Silas walked out into the freezing wind to check his massive steel bins. He did not just look at them, he listened to them. He would press his weathered ear directly against the freezing corrugated metal, listening intently to the deep, steady hum of the aeration fans. He carefully checked the exhaust vents for the absolute slightest hint of moisture or the sweet, sickening smell of spoiling grain. He meticulously monitored the internal temperature, ensuring the massive mountain of wheat remained perfectly dormant in the deep winter freeze. He was guarding his treasure with his life. While the younger men spent their long winter mornings complaining about their crushing bank loans and bad luck over hot coffee, Silas sat entirely alone at his quiet kitchen table, reading detailed international agricultural reports. He traced his thick, calloused fingers over newspaper articles detailing severe droughts creeping across foreign continents and terrible crop failures happening halfway across the world. He understood how global supply and demand actually worked. The panicked local crowd had seen a temporary county surplus and sold their entire livelihoods out of pure blind fear. Silas saw a massive global shortage quietly building in the shadows, and he was perfectly positioned to wait for the exact right moment. He possessed the ultimate, undeniable luxury of a completely debt-free man. He did not have a furious bank manager breathing down his neck, demanding a monthly payment. He just had time, he had absolute patience, and he had tens of thousands of golden bushels resting safely in the cold, dark steel. Let me tell you about the summer of 1973, because that is the exact moment the entire agricultural world was flipped completely upside down. It started as a quiet rumor at the local feed store and quickly turned into the biggest financial shockwave the Midwest had ever seen. A massive, unprecedented drought had completely devastated the wheat crops across the ocean. To prevent absolute mass starvation, foreign governments began quietly negotiating the largest international agricultural purchases in the history of the world. They secretly bought millions upon millions of tons of American wheat directly from the major export terminals. By the time the news officially broke to the general public, the massive national surplus that everyone had been so terrified about had vanished completely overnight. The global commodity market absolutely exploded. Wheat prices doubled in a matter of days. Then they violently tripled. The trading floors in Chicago were in a state of pure, unadulterated chaos, as panic buyers desperately tried to secure whatever grain was left inside the country. Now let me ask you to picture Gordon and the rest of those heavily indebted farmers who had laughed so hard at Silas Caldwell. They had completely sold off their entire massive harvest months ago for absolute miserable pennies just to satisfy their ruthless local bankers. They had absolutely nothing left to sell. They stood in the dusty driveway of the local grain elevator, staring with pure, utter devastation at the chalkboard where the heavy-set manager wrote the daily cash prices. The numbers on that dusty board were climbing higher than any working man had ever seen in their lifetimes. Gordon and his friends were forced to stand there with empty pockets, watching the greatest financial windfall of their entire generation slip right through their empty, calloused fingers. But Silas Caldwell did not panic. And he did not rush to sell. He watched the soaring prices with the exact same quiet discipline he used to watch the winter storms. He waited patiently, letting the panic buyers drive the price higher and higher until the market reached its absolute historic peak. Then, on a bright Tuesday morning, he walked out to his massive steel storage bin. He flipped the mechanical switch to turn off the deep humming aeration fans, and he finally unlatched the heavy steel doors. A massive golden avalanche of perfectly preserved wheat poured heavily into his waiting transport augers. Silas did not use his old rusted grain wagons this time. The harvest was far too valuable. He hired an entire fleet of heavy commercial transport trucks to haul his massive treasure. A long, slow parade of massive diesel trucks rolled directly into the exact same grain elevator where he had been so viciously mocked just months before. The arrogant elevator manager was completely sweating through his shirt as he tested the incoming grain. He was desperately hoping to find mold or moisture or any excuse so he could deduct the price. But the wheat was absolutely perfect. It was premium grade, completely untouched by the winter dampness because Silas had guarded it with his life. The manager had to write a bank draft that was so incredibly large, his hands physically shook while holding the pen. When Silas took that piece of paper, it represented millions of dollars in cold, hard cash. Gordon and the rest of the crowded room watched in absolute stunned silence. The arrogant farmers, who had once called him a foolish old man, were now staring at the wealthiest individual in the entire county. Silas did not gloat, and he did not laugh. He simply folded the massive check, slipped it into his faded denim overalls, paid for a single cup of black coffee, and walked quietly out the door, leaving the entire room completely speechless.
Let me ask you something. Why do so many incredibly hardworking people lose everything they have built? It is not because they are lazy, and it is not because they are stupid. It is because they completely surrender their absolute freedom to the local bank. When you owe massive amounts of money, you entirely lose the ability to make clear, rational decisions. You are violently forced to sell your own hard work out of pure, unadulterated panic just to satisfy the demanding bankers and survive another single month. But when you are completely debt-free, like Silas Caldwell, you possess the ultimate luxury in this unpredictable world. You possess the incredible power of absolute patience. You do not have to blindly sell your golden harvest when the market is crashing. You can simply lock the heavy steel doors, turn on the deep humming fans, and quietly wait for the absolute perfect moment. Sometimes the single most valuable piece of machinery on any farm is not a shiny new tractor. It is the quiet, stubborn discipline to wait while the rest of the world panics. Before we finish, I want to share a small secret. While the stubborn spirit and quiet wisdom of this tale beat loudly in the heart of every rural American town, the specific names and events are a carefully crafted legend. It is a fictional tribute dedicated to the countless debt-free farmers who absolutely refuse to surrender their hard-earned independence to panicked crowds and demanding bankers. If you truly believe in the absolute power of extreme patience and living entirely debt-free, please hit that like button and subscribe to The Farm Legacy. Tell me in the comments right now if you have ever stubbornly held on to something valuable when everyone else aggressively told you to sell it. Until next time, always remember that true freedom simply means owing nothing to anyone.